Science has finally revealed that the Marlborough Mound is a prehistoric monument of national importance. Archaeologists and carbon dating of core samples have pinpointed the mound's age and origins at around 4,400 years ago.
This is the second tallest prehistoric monument in Europe.
Today, the 19-metre-high mound has a substantial covering of trees, surrounded by rampant undergrowth. But 4,000 years ago, was it an important landmark? And if so, how was it used? No one really knows, but there's no shortage of guesswork.
It clearly has a ritual function as well as a social function.
I think the Marlborough Mound was a shrine to a water god.
Somebody saw the place named Marlborough and thought, Merlin, great, well, what about him? He's buried under the castle mound.
Picking up the threads of evidence, a number of Marlborough College's history students have begun their own inquiry.
I set out to look at the influence of Lady Hertford on the mound.
Putting together research findings.
That's when they draw the connection between Marlborough and Merlin.
To reveal what archaeologists and historians
I hadn't realised we were nearly at the top. I thought it was much further.
currently believe.
We're creating history as we go.
This film tracks what they've discovered and underlines how much remains hidden and unexplained. Some time ago, the Marlborough Mound Trust began commissioning work to conserve, protect, and interpret the monument. It's a long-term project, but eventually the tree canopy will be removed and the earth stabilized. A delicate process that needs doing very carefully. Marlborough Town is a busy market town with many visitors. Lots drawn to the ancient landscape of the surrounding area. Marlborough's own prehistoric mound has been described as a little sister to the world-famous Silbury Hill, just a few miles away.
The main thing about researching the mound is the fact that we have no real information on it at all, and so it's sort of a huge amount of speculation. You can make up your own theories about why the mound was created, who was creating it, the reasons for it. But you also can use information from Silbury Hill, and because obviously a lot more research has been done into the prehistoric side of that, because they think with Silbury Hill that it was created with lots of different combinations of soils from all over Britain.
But is it frustrating to have so many theories circling around?
In a way, it's not really a frustration so much as the exciting part of it, because people that don't know any sort of real information about it can come up with their own conclusions.
Marlborough College's pupils untangle some of the complex archaeological questions.
We know that the Marlborough Mound is considerably smaller than Silbury Hill, but were they built through the same process?
Both mounds weren't constructed just as single entities, but were constructed in a series of stages, probably beginning as quite small mounds made up of materials like gravel and clay and so forth, and then they become progressively enlarged.
Can we ever know for certain why the mound was built?
I think we might do. I think we're always optimistic as archaeologists. I think the only way that we're going to understand this is to do more investigation, so that would probably involve excavation. But also, as our knowledge of the Neolithic develops, and also as our ability to interpret archaeological evidence develops, I think there's a good chance that we could come close to understanding. It wasn't long ago when Stonehenge seemed like a considerable mystery, but I think over the last few years we've made considerable advances in actually understanding that monument. And if we can understand Stonehenge, I think we can probably understand the Marlborough Mound.
From the air, a clearer picture emerges of how the prehistoric landscape might have shaped up.
The little area of Wiltshire around Marlborough is one of the most important in the entire planet for human belief and the building of great monuments. It contains the largest stone circle in the world, that at Avebury, which is in a gigantic bank and ditch, and near it Silbury Hill, which is the largest prehistoric mound in Europe. The River Kennet flows around it, and downstream you find the Marlborough Mound.
For centuries, historians and archaeologists have puzzled over the significance and identity of Silbury Hill and the mound at Marlborough.
We can make pretty informed guesses about the use of big mounds like Silbury and Marlborough. On the whole, there are two different classes of use. One is that they're platforms that pretty important people would climb up to the top in order to address a crowd or to do things on top that everybody could see, or that they're able to see important things from the top. The other class of explanation is the mound itself means something. So it stands for the body of a goddess, or the body of earth, or it stands for the landscape around. It's got all the spirits of the stones and the trees and the plants and the rocks, because you put all of those things into the mound. So they're one big happy family together working for you.
For a while, many believed that the mound's origins were linked to the Norman invasion in the 11th century. And evidence does indeed tell us that it was the motte on which the keep of Marlborough Castle was built just 50 years after the Norman conquest. But archaeologists from English heritage have been digging deeper.
What we know about these monuments is that they are absolutely integrally linked to water. Water was important, and clearly they are located here because of the water. Silbury Hill is located at the very start of the River Kennet. Marlborough Mound, again, right beside the River Kennet in a low-lying area, and it's surrounded by springs. There aren't just one spring, there are a number of springs here.
Geologists point to the underlying chalk terrain and its impact on the fresh springs.
Rainwater sinks in until you get to the saturated zone, which is known as the water table. And once the water table is at the surface, you either get a river or a spring, or both. Springs come out where the water table hits the surface, and then these will form a river like the Kennet.
You have to imagine how that would have been perceived in the Neolithic period. And I think that it's clear that it was perceived in religious terms. And I think that these are sacred sites, and it may well be that they were sacred sites long, long before any monument was constructed here. People were already coming here to worship.
All people worship water. Water is a life-giving force, and you build a hill just to glorify the fact that you're at a spring source, a water source.
Not only is water an essential element of life, but it would also have been associated with purity and the afterlife, as well as providing an important means of transport.
Rivers themselves are routeways, and it may well be that in the Neolithic period these great rivers are what people were using to come in from the continent and up the riverways right into the heartlands of England and Great Britain more broadly.
Water seems important in that there's water close by, but whether there's some kind of intense religious relationship between the earth and the water, or whether if you're going to have hundreds of people building a whacking great mound, you need to have a water supply for them nearby, I just don't know.
The first stage of work on the mound is underway, with the removal of part of the tree cover and the laying of fresh soils.
The principle that we're doing is putting the jelly mould back on top of the jelly. At the moment, there is nothing holding the mound together except basically the tree roots and the undergrowth. And as we want to restore it with grasses, which would then hold the chalk mound together, we're wanting to bring in material that will reform the overall outer skin. So that's the jelly mould going back on the jelly to hold it together.
Set up in 2000, the Mound Trust began its work with a period of research and investigation, clearing the ground of debris in the process.
The college water tank was on the top of the mound, which was a pretty horrible, like a swimming pool up there really, an ugly excrescence. So we got that removed because the college had an alternative water supply. And then we took down a brick pillar, and then we began planning for the future and beginning to think about the restoration of the shell grotto, but we didn't have any money. And we began to think about the danger of the trees on the mound and what we wanted to achieve.
In the 18th century, Lady Hertford, a personal attendant to Queen Caroline, the wife of King George II, cut a grotto into the side of the mound. Later used as a bike shed, it's now in urgent need of restoration.
Right, I've got it. Yeah, okay. But they don't need to do anything. The grotto is very much an 18th century feature, 1730s. We need to stabilise it. There is some movement on the brickwork vaulting. The flint work to the outside is all looking in a pretty poor condition, having been repointed in a mixture of horrible different sort of hard pointings and cements and things. And long term, we would very much like to reopen it to make it a wonderful location in itself.
Today, for Marlborough College's pupils, the Mound is a source of study and a marker of college history. But it hasn't always been so.
The Mound is a remarkable historical feature which has been systematically ignored by the people who've owned the site, the school, since 1843. And actually, to be fair to the college, it was ignored for the previous 100 years as well because it was a coaching inn, and the Mound provided nothing more than an amusing garden feature which was not well looked after from 1740s onwards. And I suspect that the chapel may even have been built by the Victorians where it was to hide this awful pagan secret.
From being the site of a Norman castle, the castle buildings passed from monarch to monarch. Gradually falling out of favour and into disuse, they were eventually given over to the Seymour family.
Henry VIII had a wife, Jane Seymour, who died in childbirth, but she managed to give him a son, Edward, and in gratitude he gave her family the land here and Marlborough Mound.
Myth-making also features in the story of the Mound. Known in popular imagination as Merlin's Mount, the Mound acquired a reputation for being the very place where Merlin was buried. The pupils want to know why such an idea might have taken hold.
Why do you think that the myth of Merlin's burial in the Mound is such an attractive one to believe?
Because you've got a spectacular monument here, a really spectacular one. Like Stonehenge, which Merlin was meant to have built, it is something that needs an explanation. So, of course, Merlin and magic come into something which is so spectacular that the people of the time couldn't see how it was done.
Why do you think we seem to have a need to associate places with myths?
Because place names are actually myths in themselves. Places were terribly important to people in the ancient world. They believed that there were spirits of place, and so when you get the association between a name and a person, it's often an attempt to explain the name, but also to give it a kind of personal, if you like, deity attached to the place. So Merlin gets attached to Marlborough because of the name of Marlborough.
The town's Latin motto, "Where now are the bones of wise Merlin?" persuaded many that his remains were beneath the mound itself.
There's this myth that Merlin is buried underneath the mound, but the name actually only comes in once these myths start to become popular. So in the middle of the 13th century, when people start to know about Merlin and about Arthur, that's when they draw the connection between Marlborough and Merlin.
When do people stop believing in the myth?
Really, I suppose in the 18th century, when people did research and discovered that Marlborough had a quite different meaning and was nothing to do with Merlin. And also, there was a time when Merlin was more or less forgotten and was a kind of figure of fun, actually. And it's only in the 19th and 20th century that we've gone back to these myths again.
Affection for the Merlin story has brought Vicky Jo and her husband Robin from the United States to Marlborough. They have a special connection to the mound.
Well, it's 10 years and 1 day since we were married, and we had our civil ceremony in Marlborough Town Hall, followed by a hand fasting ceremony at Stonehenge.
You're brought together and they have a ribbon and they have you hold your hands and they tie the hands together with a ribbon and it symbolizes that you're married. I'm just thrilled to be here. The Arthurian legends have charmed us for a long time when we were here on the day of our wedding. So coming up here and knowing that even though it's not true that Merlin was buried here, still there's an aura of the mythos of Merlin that's present. So there's a thrill for me around that.
But I still like the idea of Merlin being a genuine figure of some sort with mystical powers. I like the sound of that.
The myth still lives on. You still have people, probably the people who don't know much about the mound,
For them, the mound is Merlin's burial place, whether they believe it or not. That's the thing that people who know little about the mound do know. But then there's sort of the deeper you dig, the more you find out that the link is quite tenuous.
By 2011, technology had advanced to the point at which, with the support of English Heritage, core samples could be extracted from sections of the mound and sent for laboratory testing to determine just how old it was.
Everybody said that the mound was a Norman motte, but there was always the suspicion, or indeed an alternative theory, that actually it was much older than that, but there was no proof.
6 cores were drilled and 4 samples taken from different levels to provide shards of ancient charcoal for carbon dating.
One extremely excitable day, I got a phone call from the dating lab, and they told me that the Marlborough Mound dates to 2400 BC.
Jim Leary phoned up from English Heritage and said, "I've got the results." So I said, "Yes, and what?" And he waited. He paused, as they do on these horrible reality shows. And he said, "It's 2400 BC.
Primed by the new date evidence, theories about how long it took to construct the mound begin to emerge.
Now we need many, many more dates to be much more certain, but we have dates from near the base and dates from near the top, and we can use that to give us a broad understanding of how long it took to construct the whole thing. And it was over a period of time, but in a huge amount of time, so we're probably looking at a century or so, 4 or 5 generations of people. What that tells us is that we really ought not to be thinking about these monuments in terms of their final form. We have to think through the process of construction, and clearly it was the process of construction rather than the final form that was of importance.
What this means is now we know the age of the mound, we can relate it to other monuments of the same kind of age, places like Avebury, Marden and Stonehenge, and so we can understand that it's not a construction that's designed for a strictly functional purpose, like a castle or an elevated residence or whatever, but it's a monument which had a ceremonial function.
A short distance away at Oxford Castle, author and former head of drama at Marlborough, Nigel Bryant, dispels the idea that Marlborough's mound could have begun life as a Norman motte and castle.
There are 2 very good reasons for going to Oxford Castle, and the first is the mound behind me, because that mound is the motte of the Norman castle that was built here at Oxford, just as there was a Norman castle built at Marlborough. And before recently, when the mound was definitively dated as being Neolithic, 4,500 years old, some people said, but it could just as easily be medieval, maybe the Normans built it for their castle. That never seemed terribly likely, and when you come here and see that, you realise how unlikely it is, because it's nothing like as big as the Marlborough Mound. And why would you go to all that trouble of building a mound that size just to put a keep on top?
Back in Marlborough, the construction of a new spiral path is advancing at a pace. Architect Peter Carey, himself an old Marlburian, is coordinating the work.
It's very exciting because what we are now standing on is the first round of the path that will be taken up to the top of the mound. This is real progress.
But there's a huge dilemma. The trees need to be cleared quickly, despite the fact that too much disturbance could make the earth mound unstable and risk collapse.
Gradually, the surface of the mound is deteriorating, and you've got the situation where these particular plants are rooting into the surface of the mound, which is holding the mound together for the time being. But all you need is one of these enormously overgrown trees to blow over in a wind, and you have a significant amount of damage done to the primary structure.
The prehistoric landscape that surrounds Marlborough is part of a World Heritage Site. Knowing that the Marlborough Mound belongs to the same era generates speculation that it may have been constructed at a time of great population upheaval and social change.
We're right on the very, very cusp of the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. So exactly at this point, we start getting evidence for the very earliest metalwork coming into the country. And alongside the metal, we get a very distinctive type of pottery called beaker pottery, and with that comes a new religion, a new way of thinking about the world, a new way of treating the dead. And so we're on this extraordinarily profound cusp in our evolutionary history, if you like.
So, was the mound the work of a native population, or could it have been constructed by newcomers?
This is the time when people are becoming much, much more mobile in Europe generally, and one of the reasons for that, I think, is their search for metal, and also a general mobility of materials. Now, they're searching not only for that, they're looking for amber, they're looking for jet, and so on. So a lot more commodities are moving around. So there is a sense of folk movement, or person movement. If I had to guess, I would say it's much more the old guard trying to put its impact on the landscape rather than the new boys coming in and doing something. It's a local response to an external stimulus. I think that's how I would see it. But, in 10 years' time, I might be totally wrong.
Professor Ronald Hutton has drawn some conclusions about the people.
The way they live is they wander with flocks and herds, sheep and cattle. And they live, as far as we can tell, in teepees and tents and yurts. They don't have villages, they don't seem to have many permanent farms. So they're rather like the old Wild West of cowboys, with great bunches of animals moving across prairies. And the reason why they build gigantic monuments is to give themselves something permanent in the landscape. As they don't have permanent homes, what they do is stop off at certain times of the year and meet up with hundreds, in some cases thousands and thousands of other people driving in their flocks and herds towards them, and have religious ceremonies and parties.
You sort of got to get into the mindset of the person living at the time and what was important to them, and so you've got to look at sort of the seasons and things like that, and water, and there's quite a lot of interesting parts of the surrounding area, and there's clearly some sort of social shift at the time, because before, about sort of 3,500 to 2,400, where there was a lot of farming and the growth of agriculture in Britain, it was quite an unsort of stable time, and maybe this was a way of sort of bringing the people together.
If ritual was a repeating part of the ancient calendar, when did things happen?
We can't tell what form the rituals took when people gathered, because that's totally dependent on their belief systems. We don't know what prehistoric people believed in. But we can say at what times of the year they were probably there. There are four in particular that matter to people with that kind of lifestyle.
Fire ceremonies at midsummer may have represented homage to the life-giving sun. In midwinter, the turning year could have marked rebirth and hope. And perhaps other rituals took place at the beginning and the end of the herding season.
If these people lived by herding livestock, the time when the summer pastures open up and the fresh green grass is sprouting and can be eaten by the animals is a time of merrymaking. We call it May Day. There are lots of other names for it. And the time of year when the grass starts to wither and the summer pastures close down and you have to feed your stock on hay and get them into folds and corrals. We call that Halloween these days.
Marlborough College has always valued and taught about its historic environment. Now the prehistoric mound has become part of that educational resource.
I don't think there's any place in this country that has such an extraordinary history, from massive, mysterious Neolithic building to Norman castle to royal residence to stately home of Seymour family, grand coaching inn with an illustrious history, and then a school which has become one of the most fascinating places in the country in terms of the history of education.
In partnership with the Mound Trust, the college is bringing its mound back to life.
The mound is one of the largest man-made mounds in Europe. It's not too silly to say that it's almost one of England's pyramids. It's something which is of huge historical and archaeological value. And that is something that the young ought to know about.
Although the original purpose of the mound remains unknown, repair and renewal needs to forge ahead. The question is, on which period of history should restoration settle?
What we're doing is we're going back to the last period where it was stable, where it was looked after, where it was properly maintained.
An 18th century home for the Marquis of Hertford and the Seymour family, Lady Hertford, decided to create a garden that entwined the mound itself.
She was at the forefront of the British landscaping movement and did a lot to the gardens here. She actually built the Grotto. She saw Alexander Pope's Grotto in Twickenham and was compelled to create her own. At the same time, she loved culture and poetry, so she was the patron of two very well-known poets, James Thomson and Stephen Duck.
The original spiral path wound its way up the mound, taking visitors to a gathering point at the summit.
The mound is part of a 17th century formal garden, and garden mounds were quite important. In England, they started becoming a feature of gardens in the late 16th century. It wasn't so much that the mound would be planted, it would be that you can look from the mound at the plantings below.
This was also a time when English horticulture and gardening skills were becoming greatly valued, possibly inspired by a renewal of interest in the power of nature and the natural world itself.
England had become, well, poised to become the great gardening nation of Europe.
Once a year, the Marlborough Mound Trust holds a dinner and annual lecture. It's the bequest of Eric Elstob, an old Marlburian, whose legacy brought the trust into being.
I shared a study with Eric at school, and he's an old mate of mine. And we were having lunch one day, and as a pupil, he always had an interest in the mound. He was always the one with the alternative story, and he was always right to the alternative view, and he was always right. And he said, well, I'd like to set up a trust to have a look at the mound. And with the agreement of the college, he did just that.
Eric had a remarkable talent for seeing things that other people didn't see. He saw the mound and he said, we're going to start a trust. And the only condition he laid down in the trust deed, he was very insistent that unlike a lot of other trusts, the trustees were to hold an annual dinner, and for that annual dinner, he commissioned from a silversmith this splendid decanter in the shape of Marlborough Castle. Well, more or less in the shape of Marlborough Mound and Castle. It's a little bit stylised to fit the purpose for which it's made.
Scientific confirmation of the age of the mound has been described as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Britain so far this century. But there are many unanswered questions and much speculation.
The fact that Silbury Hill and Marlborough's Mound were built in very unprominent positions, they are deliberately obscured from long sight. They are hidden almost in the valley. And to me, that means that their function is not to be seen at a distance like modern monuments. It is actually the act of being there and being made, the process of being created, is what is important about them, and not the end result.
So can there be a definitive interpretation?
What I do know is it's a very evocative place, and it's been a long human tendency to create stories about places that are particularly potent, as the Marlborough Mound certainly is. I mean, I've got a fairly good idea of what I think probably it was, which is a monument to the great Earth goddess, the Neolithic goddess, who was a pan-European figure.
The notion of Mother Earth, with the mound as a symbol of fertility and motherhood on the landscape, is one line of research.
You've got sort of things about how the mound might be an empty womb and things like this, quite sort of abstract theories, but still they could have been quite important at the time, sort of the female element of parts of it.
As summer draws to a close, a gathering marks the near completion of a further phase of renewal and celebrates the restoration of Lady Hertford's Grotto.
So could you tell me a bit about what's going on this evening?
We are unveiling a plaque to commemorate the restoration of the Shell Grotto, and it is now looking magnificent, although not fully restored inside. It marks the culmination of an enormous amount of work which has been going on in the last few years towards its restoration. So you can see it is now in its magnificent form, fully restored.
It's been a painstaking process. with the delicate interior shell decoration a particular challenge. Marlborough's history pupils want to know how the grotto was used.
What is the significance of the grotto?
It's part of the original garden laid out by Lady Hertford in the early 18th century.
How did Lady Hertford affect the identity of the mound?
Well, she has. I mean, nowadays, of course, this mound is very old indeed, and you would not be allowed to build a decorative grotto in the side of it now. But fortunately for us, we've got it.
3 small pools are sunk into the ground near the entrance. When the sun shines, a rippling pattern of light is refracted into the grotto itself. An unexpected revelation for the archaeologists.
It was a great surprise when we got to excavating outside here, because we had designed a big semicircular pool with a grating over it. And in fact, these 3 pools on excavation were found to be there.
These are horses' teeth.
Restoration of the mound is a lengthy process. Identifying its original purpose even more challenging. The Mound Trust is determined that renewal is done well and with great care.
These monuments are constantly alive. They're being tweaked and altered, mutating from one generation to the next to become what that generation perceived it to be. And it would have been no different through the prehistoric period. They would have seen it in different ways, and in the medieval period they saw it as Merlin's burial place. Now in the college grounds it becomes in a sense an artefact and what we want to see it as. And it's so wonderful to see the mound spiral being replaced, because again it gives a sense that it's an alive monument, it's a living monument. One of the saddest things about Silbury Hill is seeing it as in a sense it's stagnated, it's being preserved in some sort of idealised Neolithic state, which is complete nonsense. I mean, we're now 4,500 years later, and we have 4,500 years of erosion and addition and tweaking here and there and change. And so these monuments, to be kept alive, they need to be kept alive in that generation's mind. And so it's great to see the Marlborough Mound being kept alive.
Archaeology is very, very fast changing, much more so than history, I think, because the evidence is just pouring out of the ground as we speak, new evidence. It's changing our perception, so constantly we're having to revise our ideas. So that's the excitement of archaeology. It's a very fast changing thing, and people can comprehend it as well. People who are not specialists can take part in the excitement of this changing subject.
If the Marlborough Mound Trust is committed to restore, conserve, preserve and maintain the mound, it's equally serious in wanting to explain the archaeological and historic significance of the prehistoric site. So how far could developments take us?
I would love to see almost all, if not the whole of the canopy of trees removed, and I would love to see the circular path fully restored all the way up, and the peak of the mound used for certain functions, maybe on Midsummer's Day and so on, by the college from time to time. And it should become very much more part of the education of the students at the college, so that they understand that they have in the midst of the grounds something which is a World Heritage Site.
It's a mystery, and I think it's very important that young people know that mysteries are important, that not everything is immediately tangible. This is a school which is about sort of elasticity of thought, and to have something which is almost unbelievably old and big in the centre of the school is something which is quite unique.
While the mound's original identity is yet to be revealed, we can be grateful that Eric Elstob's legacy gives us the chance to question, research and restore.
There's a lot to do, but in 25 years' time it will be very exciting. And I may say that if Eric were here today, he would be absolutely thrilled that his intuition has led to this remarkable transformation in terms of the minds of the public and students as to the importance of the mound.
Perhaps we'll never know what the mound was for and why it was constructed. Or maybe a fresh insight, some new evidence will suddenly bring the picture into focus. For the moment, we can only ask and imagine.